And a good Thursday morning to you. I'm meteorologist Pete Malone for your around 10 a.m. update on July 7th. We are fortunately nice and quiet in the tropics. And I was going back and I was looking at the numbers here. We're about 36 days into hurricane season. There are, of course, we go through November 30th. We still have a big chunk of the season ahead of us. We actually have the majority of the season ahead of us, as you can see here. But fortunately, we're getting a little bit of a break. We're 3 names in. We've had Alex, Bonnie, and Colin. The next name is Danielle, but fortunately things look to be quiet at least through this weekend. We'll guarantee you that much. And really beyond that, the tropics look like they're going to behave. You could see there, though, late August and September. That's when things really ramp up. And even sometimes early August can be quiet. We will see it typically changes every single year. So that's where we're at today. Not discouraging you, but not to be discouraging rather, but we still have a lot of hurricane season left of us. The great news is, once again, the Atlantic Basin is nice and quiet, and you can see there's a couple little weak tropical waves. They are fighting a lot of wind shear, a lot of dry air. That is pretty typical in the month of June, and I overlaid once again that Saharan dust, and notice we've got a big plume of Saharan dust that's come off the continent of Africa now, making its way through the Atlantic, and this just means with all this dry air and wind shear that tropical waves are not going to be able to do much at all. Now, typically, when we're watching, a quiet part of the Atlantic Basin, we still keep an eye on what we call homegrown systems, and these are more typical in June and July, and they usually come from disturbances that ride maybe off the U.S. into the Gulf or off the East Coast, and they try to sit there and spin up, and then if the conditions are just right, they can develop. Now, I will say next week, our pattern is going to return back to more of a stormy pattern. This is by Sunday. This stormy pattern returns to the Gulf Coast, and it lingers on and off throughout much of next week. Now, the National Hurricane Center is not highlighting anything, and just something we'll be keeping an eye on. But what's going to happen next week is the ridge is going to weaken some. A little weak frontal boundary. It's technically a cold front, but it's not going to bring any colder air. But it's a weak frontal boundary. We'll get down here along the Gulf Coast and kind of stall out and would enhance our chances for showers and storms. And if the conditions are just right, if some of these storms can get over the Gulf of Mexico, we're off the East Coast, and if they can persist and if they're under relatively weak wind shear, that low pressure will begin to drop, and you could sometimes get a tropical system trying to develop. This happens every single year, and you really got to have the right pattern to do this. So I do think we'll be keeping an eye on the northern Gulf and off the East Coast next week, maybe as early as Monday and Tuesday, to see what any of these storms do. If they do try to get into the Gulf and just sit there and fire up and pressure start to drop, then we'll definitely be watching. Right now, not being highlighted, but that is the pattern we're going to be in into next week. And even if something doesn't develop, the pattern is going to be relatively stormy over the Gulf Coast and off parts of the East Coast through next week, with multiple rounds of showers and storms. And just like a couple of days ago on the Gulf Coast, we were dealing with heavy enough rain that was leading to some areas of street flooding and localized flooding. So regardless of if anything does try to pop up next week, we're still going to have some rainfall around. Unfortunately, that'll keep our temperatures in the upper 80s to near 90s. Still be warm and muggy, but at least it's not brutal heat. So something we'll be keeping an eye on for you, and we'll let you know if the Hurricane Center decides it wants to talk about it, but right now they are not mentioning anything. By the way, as I mentioned off the top here, we've had Alex, Bonnie, and Colin. Our average sea storm develops in August, so we are ahead of schedule with that already, but our next name is Danielle. And for the time being, it looks like the Caribbean and the Atlantic Basin, the main development region, are going to be nice and quiet, maybe for the next week or two, and then we'll keep a close eye once again on anything that maybe wants to be a bit more what we call homegrown. But for now, we're just watching for that chance for some storms increasing come Sunday. But that does it for around our 10 a.m. update for this July 7th. It is Thursday morning. Thank you for joining me. I'm meteorologist Pete Malone.